Welcome to our conversation with Amy Wilson. Friends, I am just so excited for you to hear from Amy and what it's looked like for her and her team to navigate this incredibly difficult season. Amy is the children's ministry coordinator at the Orchard Evangelical Free Church, and they are currently, knowing that that could change at any minute, they are currently doing Awana in person, socially distanced, and that's been an incredible opportunity for their community. So, Amy, talk to us about what does ministry look like in this season? And we're so glad to have you on today.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. So I've been at the Orchard for many years, actually, as a volunteer, and just recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, as an employee. So it's been a joy to be a part of Awana. I've grown up in Awana from the time that I was in kindergarten, so I've seen it through, and now it's great to be serving there. So I was really excited that we could actually get started. There was a time there where it looked like that wouldn't happen this fall with different closures and things. So super excited to be involved. And I get to be involved in two ways, actually, as a TNT director and also as a coordinator here at the Church of Awana in general. So yeah, it looks a little different if you were to come to our church now than if you did last fall, but I tell you what's the same, and that is the children coming through those doors, excited to be there and learning God's word, and so glad they're coming. So
Yes, I think so many of us on this conversation today, we would probably say that same thing. Like, we just want to see those kids through our doors again. We want to hear them quoting scripture. We want to see the joy on their faces, and we're willing to do what it takes so that we can get discipling with them again, you know? So, Amy, knowing that that's kind of the motivating piece that's been behind getting Awana restarted at the Orchard, what format are you using for club?
So we do have the four clubs: Cubbies, Sparks, TNT Girls, and TNT Boys. But this year we've had to format it much more as kind of small groups functioning next to each other in order to, protect against COVID. So if there were to be COVID to come in at any point, we would obviously not have to quarantine or stop the whole club. So it's kind of a club of small groups, I'll say, that do get into the same room at times, but also spend time just on their own. So,
Wow. Okay. So you've modified from more of that like classic four club kind of isolated, within themselves to much more of a small group experience. Now, what was your retention level of kids that were willing to come back?
so I would say around 30-35% or so. We're a fairly big club, fairly big church with about 250 kids in general,
Okay.
but this year we're more like 100. So, and volunteers has been a bit the same as far as kind of about the right number of volunteers coming back for about the right number of kids, as far as that 30-35%.
Wow. Okay. So if there's about 35% that are coming back, is there anything small or what do you do for those who aren't comfortable coming back yet?
We have offered a fairly simple at-home opportunity where they can buy the books and watch the large group meetings on Zoom type of a thing.
Okay. Okay. So you're really navigating both worlds. You've got the virtual equipping the family to do what they need to at home. But then you've also got that group of kids, 100 or so that are coming on a weekly basis. And so let's dig into that. Knowing that you've had to really transition to more of a small group kind of feel, what does that look like in the way you've had to change the facility usage of your church?
Good question. So we have utilized some spaces that before we weren't utilizing, like the sanctuary, for example. It's a fairly big space, and so it allows us to have our small groups enter into the sanctuary, sit together as a small group, but then be socially distanced from all other small groups. And it's, in our case, large enough to not have to have clubs using the same part of the sanctuary on any given part of club, so that we aren't having to clean between, which was one of the requirements that we would have had. So That's how, and then also one of the other things we've done is we don't have enough small group rooms for all the small groups. So sometimes we've taken larger spaces and kind of divided those up into small groups within that large group room, again, just apart from each other.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so when you saw that you were going to need to change basically your entire format, you put all the cards out on the table and you began to adjust what you knew you had around you to the new format that you had created. So as you began to develop that and you saw those pieces come into play, how did you then take the setup and structure of what you were going to do and then communicate that to your families to begin inviting them back to Awana?
Um, well, we tried to be as clear as we could through an email, and in some ways we waited a while before we communicated, just so that we felt like we had the pieces in place. And then we just tried to communicate kind of through something as simple as like bullet points, like here's what you can expect on a Tuesday night,
Yeah.
so they would know, what we were putting into place, and then they could make a decision about whether they wanted to be a part of that or not.
Okay. Wow. So you changed the format of club. You were very clear and intentional in the way that you communicated with your parents. Um, so as you began to identify that small groups was the way to go, did you guys have guidelines or almost parameters around what those guidelines needed to look like per age group and per number of kids?
We just had to refer back to some of the like CDC, and then also in our state, there were like preschool guidelines that were used at preschools as well as elementary school guidelines. So it was just a matter of looking at those and finding out what could our group size be. So just an example for you, for us, the children, young children had to be in groups of 10 or less. And so that was helpful just to have a number that we could work with. And then there were also like room capacities that we had to work with, where you could only have 50% of what was typically a room capacity in that room. So once we kind of had the numbers, we could start to think about, well, where should we put cubbies? Where should we put TNT? Where should we put, sparks, just because of the different numbers and how those would best fit in the different spaces.
Now, that sounds highly detailed, and it sounds like a lot of logistical pieces all kind of floating. Did you do that all by yourself? How did you make those decisions?
Definitely not by myself. We have a wonderful team of directors, one or two directors for each of our clubs. So we met together with them. Also, the children's director that I work with, and facilities manager, just to kind of, like you say, lay it all out on the table and look at, here's what we're up against. How can we be creative? How can we use spaces differently than we've used before, in order to fit people in? And of course, all this time, we really didn't know how many kids would even sign up, because you almost have to make decisions before you know how many are coming, so that you can have an idea of what you're doing. And then, of course, regularly we were saying, oh, well, we might have to change that, or we're going to look at this differently, or just as more information would come in. It was definitely a day-to-day work in progress.
Oh man, I can imagine. So when you guys had that first night that you started, um, did everything go perfectly? Did you realize that you had just pulled every detail across that you needed, that you had dotted every I, crossed every T, and that exact structure was going to be what you did for the rest of the year?
No. A lot of what we did worked. I mean, we walked away saying we feel like we've created a safe environment for kids to come to. So from that standpoint, it felt like things had been good, but it just took a number of weeks to feel like things went smoothly, to, adjust things. And, now it feels like it's running pretty smoothly. The new normal, I guess I'll say, that we feel like we're in, but it definitely took a while. So.
Okay. All right. So for those that are watching today, I can imagine that they're probably beginning to think through, okay, if I've heard anything about Illinois, they have pretty high restrictions. So if people in Illinois could do it, we could do it too, right? So maybe there's this courage building up in them. Um, I think that the question that all of us probably have is, okay, what are you doing about games? How do you socially distance games?
Well, good question. Because we have wanted to keep the three components of Awana where we have a large group teaching time, a small group with a leader, verse memorization, verse recitation, reciting the verses and maybe talking through the lesson, things like that, and then also a fun time. So we determined pretty quickly that we weren't going to try to have large group games, active large group games, the way that we did in Awana before, because we were required to have masks the whole evening, and we didn't feel like it was wise to have kids running around, breathing heavily in masks and things like that. So right away, we decided we were going to have to replace games with something else, and we were going to call it a fun time instead of a game time. And from there, we just prayed for creativity of how to do this on a weekly basis so that kids would enjoy it. Um, and each of our directors has done a brilliant job of coming up with different age appropriate type things that they can do in their small group time. So small group, I think, is probably a little longer than it used to be because we're incorporating the game time, quote, the fun time into that small group time. And we've done crafts and what was I going to say? Oh, board games, different kind of things that they can do in a smaller group. And probably the hardest club has been the TNT boys, just because it's hard to replace dodgeball and kickball and things like that they really love. But they've been able to they've always had this, but a competitive part where the small groups compete against the other small groups in games that they can do at their table. So sometimes they might even walk around their table. They might do a relay type thing, but at their own table. And then they can compete against the other groups by time or something like that. So it's been a good challenge, I'll tell you, to be creative and come up with some new things. And some of the kids, they probably love it more than they used to because they weren't big dodgeball kids in the first place. So they're probably liking the change, whereas others are finding it challenging, but making the most of it. So.
Wow. I I can imagine that there's that, potential easily distracted, maybe slightly rowdy group of boys that are like they just need to get that kinetic energy out, right? So I love that even in this season of constant change and having to think on your feet and figure out what this looks like, you're just consistently saying each week, how do we change? How do we grow? How do we adapt? How do we, at the very least, serve the kids that are coming on a weekly basis in helping to provide what they need? That is, you're absolutely an inspiration. Okay, so as these kids are coming and obviously pickup and drop off can't look the same. So how have your pickup and drop off procedures changed?
Well, we decided that we would kind of follow some of the school guidelines where they're not having parents come into the building. You can imagine with 100 clubbers, that could be quite a few parents entering your building.
Yeah.
And so we have done for the first time ever, a car drop off where they've driven up to a certain point. We've decided to do a temperature check. So we do that before they get out of the car. And then if the car is clear, they come in. And again, that definitely took a few weeks. It took a little while at the beginning. We asked people to be patient, things like that. But now it's running pretty smoothly. And so they drop off, they come in. We have TNT junior leaders there to help them get to club. If they're, little, now they know where they're going. But of course, at the beginning, it was a little crazy. So that's how we've chosen to do it. We may change it because with winter coming, it's actually a little trickier to do that outside. So we may have to do lines inside with social distancing where parents only come into a certain point in the church and then drop off and head out. So that's how we've done it.
Okay, so again, you've changed and adjusted to what it looks like today. And as our bitter winter is on the horizon, that may adjust again to help protect kids and families. Okay, so This has been so incredibly helpful, but I know there's one last question that many of our just our community might have on their hearts today. Let's talk about volunteers. How do you have enough in this season? Is there some sort of secret that you have to retaining and recruiting volunteers right now?
I don't know if I'd call it a secret, but I think that was the one thing that amazed us the most,
Yeah.
is how many volunteers wanted to come back. I mean, apart from asking the Lord to provide, and, I felt like I should have even done that more, they just wanted to come. And so we ended up with about, again, 30 to 35% of the volunteers wanting to come back, which suited the number of kids we've had. And I was truly amazed and just blessed by how many of them wanted to get back to serving. Um, and where possible, we have, two leaders in a group, just so that if somebody has to be out, we aren't having to have a lot of extra people in the group. But that doesn't always, happen. Sometimes you're only, we might have a leader and a junior leader, things like that. But I guess pray is probably the one thing I would say, just because I felt like the Lord provided pretty amazingly, really surprised us with that. And we tried to be open and honest with people, just communicating, hey, here's what you can expect. And then talking to people individually if they had questions, trying to be as upfront and honest about what we were planning to do so that they could make the best decision for themselves and for their family.
Yeah, absolutely. I am just so thankful for just what it's looked like for you and your team to choose the really difficult changes that have been in front of you. I mean, none of this was something that any of you wanted, right?
Oh,
Awana was going well. Your club was running smoothly, and this was an unwelcome interruption. And yet, you and your team at the Orchard have just locked into what God has called you to do, and you've continually, on a daily basis, just said yes. And so I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your willingness to do that. And thank you for continuing to reach into this community as we look to just really nurturing these kids and families and helping them to see Jesus in a time where there's so many other difficult distractions in our way.
thank you. Well, and I thank you so much for just asking about our experience. We truly have felt like missionaries heading to a foreign land where we didn't know
Mm,
what we were going to expect. We didn't know what the challenges were going to be all the time. We felt like we were having to constantly just say, I'm so sorry, I didn't think of that, or,
yeah.
we got to start over, we got to figure it out. And yet I was so, so thankful that we had that opportunity just to get started and take 1 week at a time, because we never know how many we're going to have. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'll be praying for each and every club that's trying to get started, because God is going to do great things. It's really cool.
He is. God is going to do great things. He has always done them, and
Yep.
he will continue to do them. And I am just so incredibly humbled that we are the willing vessels that God uses, and all we have to do is just allow him to use us. So again, Amy, you have a great week, and thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.